Hello and welcome, sir. We're an organization called Social Legal Literary. We talk about social issues, legal issues, and we invite speakers for talks on their papers, on their novels, on their books. And we thank you, sir, for taking out time for us. So today we are going to discuss book The Minority Conundrum, Living in Majoritarian Times. It's a book which talks about how it is to be a minority in this uh, like India is a very diverse country with different castes, religions, and communities. And this book talks about how it is to be a minority living in majoritarian times in the aspects of education, employment, and many more aspects. Today we're going to cover Disenfranchised Minorities, Dysfunctional Democracies, written by Amir Ali. So we thank you, sir, for taking time out for us.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, sir. I would like to give a small introduction of our speaker today. Our speaker today is Professor Amir Ali. He is with the Center for Political Studies at JNU. Earlier, he taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, and he was also a visiting fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. His areas of interest are political theory, multiculturalism, and group rights. He was awarded Best PhD Award for 2005 to 2006 by the Center for Political Studies. He has also been the Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow. He has also published great pieces of literature in distinguished journals like Economic and Political Weekly and Routledge. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Priya, could you please ask the first question?
My first question is that in your essay, you talked about how the targeted minorities group is likely to be portrayed as an enemy of the state, a supporter of
Right.
terrorism, and perhaps in a slightly less extreme manner as an irritant and impediment in the nation in question of
Mm.
becoming great. It is due to this that the term of what Gyanendra Pandey calls as nationalist Muslim emerged. One has to keep
Yeah.
proving their loyalty towards the nation just because they come from a certain minority group. What's your take on this?
Well, I think there are two things that I would have to say. One is that there's a certain kind of a problem with the nation state and the construction of the nation state and what has been happening to the nation state. Now, one important aspect of the nation state is that there is a nationalism that informs it. If you go back to the time of the national movement and the years after independence, I think the bandwidth of nationalism, if I can call it that, was sufficiently broad to incorporate Muslims and many, many other groups. With the passage of time, and especially in the last few years, with this regime especially, I think what I'm referring to is the bandwidth of nationalism is being kind of narrowed down. Now, because of this narrowing down, there is a certain way in which the Muslim especially is falling out of the pale. Now, because of that falling out of the pale, there is a tendency to always look at the Muslim as an irritant, as a threat, as a terrorist. So my sense is that the problem really is is the way in which the nation state has been configured and is being increasingly, becoming increasingly narrow in terms of its ambit and who it includes. So when you raise this question about the nationalist Muslim, and there are plenty of those around. When Jamia, for example, is one university where many historians, distinguished ones like Mushir Hassan, for example, Muhammad Wajid before that. I mean, there's been extensive work done on the way in which Muslims have participated in the national movement. But I think the question of the nationalist Muslim is a wrong one, because the problem really is that the Muslim will never be nationalist enough, will never be sufficiently nationalist in certain eyes. There will always be this prejudiced, jaundiced way of looking at the Muslim as in some way being an outsider. So I think that particular perspective of looking at the Muslim has to be completely done away with. This idea that there will always be a suspicious way in which you're looked at. Let me give you an example from popular culture. I think some 2 decades ago, there was this movie by Amir Khan that came out, Sarfarosh. This was back in the late 1990s. Now, in that particular movie, there is a Muslim character. And now the one thing I noticed about that movie is that the Muslim character has to prove his loyalty. I think this onus on the Muslim to have to prove one's loyalty is there's something amiss about that. A person who is born in this country, by virtue of being born of, for that matter, any, people can become domesticated and they can, become citizens. So this manner of continuously looking at people as, somehow doing wrong or being not sufficiently patriotic, I think is something very problematic. I mean, if there is one thing that one can be very patriotic right now, it is to speak the truth, which is, as you can see, there's not much of it around. And I would, especially whenever people talk about patriotism, I always, tell them that, well, look at the Constitution, look at the symbol of the Republic and what it says. It says, Satyamev Jayate, let the truth prevail. So, I mean, as I said, there is a need to recast, rethink, reimagine. That would perhaps be the best word to kind of nail. There's a need to reimagine the way that people live in this country. And it's awfully constricting to always be under this kind of a scanner of suspicion, to always be told that you're not sufficiently patriotic enough, or you have to display your patriotism in a particular sort of way. It only has to be flag waving or singing on certain songs. I mean, there are different ways in which people express their patriotism. And I think all those different ways of expressing patriotism do need to be accepted as legitimate without saying, okay, this is the only way to express it. Now, having said that, I mean, I always remind people that remember one thing, that patriotism is something that can always be misused. It is, I think it was Samuel Johnson who said, it is the last refuge of the scoundrel. So, an overzealous use of patriotism is something that will be misused. It should not be demonstrative. It should not be excessively zealous. It should be, different ways of doing things. And this is, I think, we've always talked about in this country about the capacious way in which people have wanted to belong. And I think that really kind of is the spirit that needs to be brought back. And I think what this requires is a reimagination, a very capacious reimagination, something that can, prevent people from being bogged down by narrow walls. I mean, I think I'm unself-consciously quoting Tagore there in that very famous poem that Tagore has. I mean, I think we really need to walk in a country where the head can be held up high, where the mind is without fear. And there is too much fear in this country right now, not just in this country, but across the world. There is the fear of being snooped upon, the fear of being always cast as not sufficiently patriotic, as being anti-national. For any country, for any people to thrive and prosper, the first thing you have to get rid of is fear. The next thing you got to get rid of is this, is this kind of pervasive falsehood that we see all around us. And let us invoke the truth. Let us invoke it in a spirit of genuineness. For once, let us be sufficiently, let us trust other people. That's very important. There's not much of it around in this country right now. And for the kind of healing that we need, this is, I think, the reimagination that is required.
Thank you so much, sir. Our next question. In a recent interview, Hemant Biswa Sharma claims that Muslims in his state are growing at the rate of 29% and Hindus by 10%. So we need to bring certain measures whereby the growth of the population can be slowed down. These were the things that he said. Even as the myth of large Muslim families remains as false as ever, political leaders affiliated to the RSS raised the slogan of Hindu Khatre Mein Hai. How do you view this victimization as a key role in sidelining Muslims? The second part of my question is in reference to the last part of your essay, where you talk about how if the majority population keeps quiet and are complacent, we will soon be moving towards the decline of our democracy. How do you believe this problem can be solved? What do you believe should be done to create a paradigm shift among the majority communities, to shift from looking at minorities as a threat to realizing and understanding their constitutional right and making a move to uphold the democracy?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm glad you used the term paradigm shift, because when in the previous question, when I used a reimagination, that would actually bring in the idea of a paradigm shift. I think that one thing we need at this stage, and not just in this country, but across the world, is to imagine in a very, very different sort of a way. I think our visions and our imaginations are just too constricted in the way that we think about politics. I mean, as someone who teaches political science, I think there are immense possibilities that politics holds. This is a pretty Aristotelian point to make. I mean, Aristotle, famously said that politics is the master science. And I think what we need is a different kind of politics, not a politics that is based on short-termism or winning the next election, do whatever you can to win the next election. We need a politics which is really interested in the people of this land. I mean, the problem with the way that nationalism has been configured is that it just talks about the sacralization of the territory. It fetishizes borders. Let's think about people who live in those territories. Let's think about people who live within those borders. Let's think about people whose lives are torn apart by borders. I mean, these are genuine human beings. They're not just statistics. So, in terms of the paradigm shift, I think a certain temperament of reason, a certain temperament of science must be brought back in this country. I mean, I often bewail the way in which the public discourse in this country has fallen to such degrading levels. It is abysmal the way that it's so anti-intellectual. It is so unintelligent the way that these things are talked about. Now, there is a science called demography. Anyone can read about it. That science of demography has told us that we are almost on the verge of achieving what is called a certain kind of demographic stability, that the population rate at which this country has been expanding cannot go on. It is absurd, illogical, and plain false that the Muslim population will outstrip the majority population, the Hindu population. It is just wrong. It's as simple as that. It's unscientific. People who are perpetuating this myth are being plain dishonest. Now, when I was growing up, my grandmother, especially my grandmother, both my grandmothers, my parents would tell me, "Beta, sahi bolo." Now, as a country which prides ourselves in our civilization, I don't see how any civilization can be built on falsehood. So this whole population thing is unscientific. It is, it's absurd. It is illogical. It is just plain wrong. And I think that there is a way in which people need to kind of stand up and speak for the truth. This is an old Socratic idea of being able to speak truth to power. Now, it requires a bit of courage. Okay, you can go and speak truth to, I can say to my children, for example, but to actually be able to look the powerful in the eye and tell them, "Aap galat bol rahe hain." I think this is what is required in this country at this moment. A simple, plain speaking, honest, a wrong is a wrong. Now, the problem really is, I think, with developments like social media, for example, or the way that the media in this country conducts itself in an extremely, unceremonious fashion is the most charitable word that I can use at this stage. But what we have is the constant propagation, production, perpetuation of falsehoods. There's that old saying, by the time that a lie travels halfway around the world, the truth is just barely putting its shoes on. I think what we need at this stage are people to be sufficiently honest enough to just stand up and vouch for the truth, to say that this is the truth, this is wrong, this is illogical. And I think when people start doing that, when they realize that there has come a moment, a crunch point, as we call it, when the truth has to be called out, then I think we can start the process of healing and reconciliation, which is bound to begin. I mean, at one point, people will realize that, well, this has gone too far. Now, the reason, again, why I'm emphasizing this point is because, if I'm not wrong, I think it was Edmund Burke who said that the reason why evil prevails in this world is not because of a lack of good people, but because those people don't speak out. Now, there are reasons why people are not speaking out. There's fear that if you speak out, there are bad things that can happen to you. I think somewhere this lurking fear has to kind of go away. It will go away at some point, and this can't go on. I go back to that first point, and I think I was unselfconsciously quoting Tagore, when he said that we must live in a space where the mind is without fear. Now, what is it that makes us fearful? Well, I think one of the things that makes us fearful are these falsehoods all around us. It puts it puts fear into the minds of people who are naive enough to believe them. There is fear in the minds of people who are not willing to speak out against these falsehoods. So, to kind of, that paradigm shift that you were talking about would be a combination, I think, of bringing back the scientific temperament, which was a cherished part of the freedom struggle. Of course, notions of science change. The notion of science in the last 70 years has changed. But I think science has been one of those great forces of advancement, the ways in which we have moved forward in this country and across this world. That really needs to be brought back. And along with that, simple, everyday, plain, common sense things like just plain old decency, goodness, honesty. I don't understand where these things have gone. I don't know if people are telling their children that, well, this is what it means to be a good person. Um, I'm astounded by the way that people are mouthing inane falsehoods every day on television. I mean, I look at television anchors and I say, my goodness, how do these people sleep at night? And then, Pegasus company, which has been in the news so much, and of course, Parliament has been stalled because of it. I was astounded by what they said. And they said that, well, because of us, people are sleeping at peace at night. You don't sleep at peace when you have these kinds of massive securitization walls. You sleep at peace at night when you have a good conscience. I don't know where these things have gone. This is just plain, simple decency. If a nation cannot be built on these simple, plain values, I don't know how it will ever become great.
I totally agree, sir, upon that we should speak the truth and we should have that courage. And taking forward this, that sometimes I believe that it is not just majoritarian groups who tend to marginalize minority groups, but it is also the other minority groups, like Jains, for example, who hold a very Islamophobic feelings within them. So
Right.
recently, only during Bakra Eid, I saw someone on Twitter tweeting about how Jains saved Bakras on Eid. To this, I was
Yeah.
really infuriated and I replied that it is not saving, it is stealing. You are actually hurting someone's religious sentiments and hampering their festivals. So many people got annoyed by my tweet, and within a few minutes, I started receiving hate speech from the Jain community only. So,
Mhm.
what do you think about it? Is it only majoritarian groups who continue to instill violence on minority groups, or do you think that it is other minority group as well? So for example, like Jains are somewhat assimilated with Hinduism, so they are minority groups, but they still instill violence over Muslims. So, what's your take on this?
Well, the thing about hate and being genuinely good to other people is that these are things that lurk within every single one of us. I mean, this is not exclusive to any community. Every single community of people is as capable of hating and as capable of being good to other people. Now, I think the problem really is it's very strange to see such peace-loving communities. Jainism is a religion that is premised upon, its peace. I mean, Buddhism, for example, and I've been horrified to see the ways in which Buddhism has become an instrument for the perpetuation of hate in countries like, for example, in Burma, for Myanmar, for example, or Sri Lanka. So, what we really see is that it could be any set of people. I mean, in Muslim-dominated Pakistan, for example, you have hatred against Hindus and Christians. The blasphemy laws in that country, in the way that they have been used in that country, are truly shocking. So I think what we really need to understand is that there is no monopoly of hatred and being good. That every single one of us is capable of being good. So it's a struggle within us. Now, to come back to this particular point, if I can kind of interlink the different kind of responses that I've made in this, with the previous questions, I think it's very important for people to realize that irrespective of whichever religious community that you belong to, or even you may not be part of a religious community, there are genuinely good atheists that I know. There are people who are agnostics that I know who are much better than the religious people that I know. I think there's a problem with religion itself, and it's true of all religions: Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, any religion. Religion was always meant to make you a good person, right? I mean, that's how at least I remember things growing up in a Muslim household. And my other friends who were from other religious communities, whichever religion you belong to, the point about religion was that it was meant to make you a good person. Now, what I've noticed about all religions these days is that it doesn't make you a good person. It makes you feel good about yourself. Now, by feeling good about yourself, you become very nasty to other people. So I think that really is the problem. And this kind of hatred and this kind of vehement anger is multiplied manifold by social media. So the point that you made, in order to kind of create a better society, which is what we really need, not just in this country but across the world, because we are an interlinked globe now. I mean, our welfare, our health depends on the health of everyone else across this world. I mean, the coronavirus pandemic has really underlined that particular point. What we need is to bring back some of these concerns. What needs to be eliminated is this sense of groupthink that has gone too far. This thing of my people and this other set of people. This kind of tribalism that has really set into people's mind. I mean, I would really blame a lot of identity politics for this. Not that I would completely sideline or reject identity politics, but the way in which identity politics has developed, what it has done is that it has emphasized the difference between us at the expense of the similarity that connects all of us. Because at the end of it, I think we are all human beings. I mean, every human being is going to be affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Every human being, irrespective of whether you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian or a Sikh or a Jain or Buddhist, whoever you may be, will suffer, from hunger and deprivation and lack of sleep and from fear. This is, I think, what really needs to be brought back. These are difficult questions to really answer. The amount of hatred that I see in the world right now, I would hazard to suggest has never really been seen in the world. Now, one of the reasons why this is happening is because of social media itself. So some regulation of the social media certainly is required. The way in which people, I think, to some extent, people themselves are to blame for the way that they use social media. Now, once they use social media, then of course the way that they're going to be exploited. So in the last 6, 7, 8 years, we have seen the 2013 Snowden revelations, the fact that the NSA and the British GCHQ were snooping upon their own people. The Pegasus controversy in this country, as I speak right now, I mean, why isn't the government just willing to say, "Hai ki nahi aapke paas? Have you got the Pegasus? Have you bought it?" They're just kind of stonewalling. So, but again, what this will require is for people to ask questions of their government, because at the end of it, democracy is not so much about elections. Of course, it is about elections, but more than that, it is about asking for accountability from the people who rule over you. Okay, there's that very famous line from I forget which poet. Rehbar qawm mulk bata. Rehbar qawm mulk bata. Ye kiska lahu tha kaun mara. It's the leaders who are accountable. And right now, what I see is leaders are stonewalling across the world. They're not accountable at all. Parliaments are not functioning in the way they should be functioning. The press is not asking the questions they should be asking. The press has become a platform for propaganda. So it's important to understand that democracy needs to be not just be brought back in quantitative terms. Of course, it has been depleted, but there is a certain quality of democracy that we need, a certain kind of qualitative improvement. Now, for that qualitative improvement of democracy to happen, what we need is a public discourse that is elevating rather than kind of degenerating and degrading to the lowest and most abysmal levels. In the last over the last decade, what I've been shocked by, especially as a political science, is the way that democratic discourse has degenerated to such abysmal levels, which, as I said a little while ago, is not just anti-intellectual, but it's just unintelligent, it's stupid. The kind of things that people say and get away with is just shocking. How can you allow this stupidity to kind of proliferate and dominate and ruin people's lives? I often think at some point this has to end. And for that, it's always I'm always glad to talk to students and young people. And when you asked me for this interview, I said it is my duty to talk to people. People who are younger than me, people who are students. This is the only way in which we can raise the level of democratic discourse. I am one of those people who genuinely believes in democracy, not just a democracy of tokenism where you just go and vote. That's just not what democracy means. Democracy is much, much more than that. It means the constant nurturing and sustaining of a democratic mindset, whereby if you are questioned, you can answer that question by looking people in the eye. I think I would ask everyone, can your leaders look you in the eye and give you a genuine response? No, not many can do that. You look across the world, not many leaders can look you in the eye and really give you a question. This is what is required. Self-respect on the part of people. I think the problem with the people, a lot of the time, large numbers of people, is that they're just too beholden to their leaders. I'm often very taken aback by this term that we have for the government in India, Sarkar ko Mai Baap kehte hain. Sarkar is not the Mai Baap. To use the words of our own Prime Minister, Pradhan Sevak, let us remind the people that they are at the service of the people, the leaders. And that is something that I think we've forgotten. Yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor. Last question is that we would like to ask you in relation to the rhetoric mentioned in the beginning of your essay, where you wrote that the majority of the people in democratic states are shifting towards autocratic regimes, and even though they
Yes.
are aware about the marginalization of minorities, they are still voting for authoritarian leaders like Trump in USA, Boris Johnson in UK, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and of course the Prime Minister of India. It can be
Uh-huh.
noticed that there have been many movements of dissent against these leaders by the minority communities. So I think it is
Yeah.
safe to say that the voters are well aware about the ostracization of the minorities, but still a large majority of them are voting for these authoritative regimes. Why do you think this phenomena is happening?
That's a good question, but I don't have an immediate answer to that. Let me just try to kind of respond to it by focusing on two countries, and I'll kind of extend it in towards other countries. The US and the UK, for example. I mean, I was relieved when Biden came to power in the elections last year. It was a great relief. I think if had Trump come back to power, the world would have really kind of gone down the precipice of doom and calamity at a much faster rate. I mean, not that I'm a great fan of Biden, but at least he's much better than of course Trump. I think the reason why people fall for these leaders is just the simplistic appeal of these leaders. So if one takes Boris Johnson, for example, I mean, the reason why he won in the 2019 elections with a huge majority is because of that very simplistic and, to be very frank, very stupid slogan: "Get Brexit done." Brexit will never be done, as far as I can see it. I mean, I've just written a book on Brexit, which will be out next month in August, and I think that the reason why people fall for these simplistic slogans is because they don't think through the issues as much as they should be thinking. So what is required is a certain kind of public education, which instills in people the ability to understand complex issues. The problem, I think, really is with school education, which kind of, it teaches children to think in boxes and neat categories. And when you think in boxes, neat categories, you're going to, you're bound to be taken in by these slogans. So, around the time of the 2019 elections, I remember writing a few articles, and I asked some of my friends in Britain, I said, "Are you serious? Do you really think this man is going to get Brexit done?" So, I think that people are really kind of, they're taken for a ride. And the sooner that people realize that they are being taken for a ride, that things will start changing. Now, what aids leaders of this authoritarian bent of mind from taking people for a ride? Well, I think the media plays a very important role in this. To take the UK example, the media is so completely dominated by the Australian media baron Rupert Murdoch, whom I'm sure you would have heard of, and a particular publication of his, which is quite outrageous, The Sun. Now, in the last 40 years or so, every single prime ministerial candidate that The Sun, the tabloid owned by Rupert Murdoch, has endorsed, has gone on to win. Now, this shows the kind of stranglehold that media of this kind have over people's minds. So, it's, and of course our own country's legion in terms of the kind of electronic media news channels that we have, and the kind of things that they keep saying every night. So in terms of authoritarian leaders taking people for a ride with their stupid, simplistic slogans, I think the media has a very significant role to play. But I think it's very important for people to really kind of take responsibility. I mean, at the end of it, people are not young little children. You can't say, "Oh, you were foolish enough to be taken for a ride." And for that to happen, I think there must be a much greater degree of awareness and consciousness amongst people. And you look at a lot of these surveys, you can't blame people for this, but I think the reason why this has happened is because of an educational system that has just not been fit for purpose, an educational system that does not emphasize sufficiently a certain kind of the significance of the public. So education has become this kind of a commoditized good that people basically buy to get good careers. You become good doctors or engineers so that you can earn a lot of money. I think that aspect of education has to be kind of done away with, the publicness of education. Now, having made that point, let me also say that I'm looking at Latin America with a great deal of optimism. I have a feeling that Jair Bolsonaro, who you mentioned, will perhaps lose in the elections that I think are going to be happening next year. And Lula da Silva has been cleared by the court. He was convicted of corruption charges. He went to jail. The reason why that, a lot of people felt that happened was to keep him away from contesting elections. Now, with someone like Bolsonaro, who is referred to as the Trump of Latin America, and of course Johnson is referred to as the Trump across the Atlantic, I think that the global political headwinds will start changing. I think they have already started changing. So Latin America is one continent that I'm really kind of looking out for, because it's a part of the world that we don't look at enough. But let me give you two other examples. Something that just happened yesterday itself. I was watching the inaugural speech of the new Peruvian president, Pedro Castillo. Now, this man is a peasant. He's a village school teacher. He won by a narrow, wafer-thin 44,000 vote margin, but he won. One of the most remarkable things that he said yesterday was that his priority is going to be a form of public health. And I think that really needs to be brought back. So in order for democracies to sustain itself, what it will require will be to be kind of strengthened by a public education, not a private education system, not private universities, but a public education system funded by the state, a public healthcare system, funded by the state, by the exchequer. Now, a lot of people have suggested, and I would agree with them, that democracy is in danger, and I think it is a clear and present danger. When people say this, they're not exaggerating. Democracy clearly is in danger, not just in this country, but across the world. Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, why is this happening? I think the reason why this has happened is because democracy and politics in countries did not sufficiently underline the publicness of things like education, the publicness of things like healthcare, the publicness of things like housing. All these three that I've just mentioned, healthcare, housing, and education, have increasingly gone into private hands. This is what has resulted in the degeneration of democracy. So in the essay that I've written, it's called Dysfunctional Democracies. I think the reason why democracies have become dysfunctional is precisely because of a lack of nurturing democracies. The thing about democracy is that, there is a core kernel of democracy, the core of democracy itself. That is not enough to sustain it. It needs a certain kind of environmental surround in order for democracy to really make meaning in people's lives, in order to prevent it from being just that kind of meaningless, inane exercise where people just go and cast their vote. It's important to kind of surround it by this kind of publicness that I talked about, because at the end of it, look, you analyze what democracy means. Democracia, it means, the power with the people. Now, if there is, if there is everything going to private hands, democracy is bound to, it's bound to suffer, and it is really on the verge of collapse in many of these countries. Just to take one more example from Latin America, Chile is the other country which has been very interesting, because in a referendum that was recently held, many progressive candidates, many women were appointed to the Constituent Assembly to rewrite the Constitution, a Constitution that was drafted during the times of Augusto Pinochet back in 1980. Now, these are the global headwinds which are changing. Now, these global headwinds will reach our country sooner rather than later, but they will have to reach. I am quite often, I like to quote Gramsci, that very famous quote of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So at a certain point, I do become an incorrigible optimist. The point that I often make to my students and people that I talk to is that this state of affairs is clearly unsustainable. This cannot go on for much longer. There is a certain kind of stirring change in the world. I think we need to keep our ears to the ground to understand the direction which the wind will be blowing. In the whole new liberal era that we have witnessed for the last 40 years is not giving solutions to problems. It is creating more solutions, more problems. And to go back to the first question that I think was asked, and the point about imagination, I think in the year 2021, what we have to really think about is to imagine a world order after the pandemic. Now, that's easier said than done. I mean, imagining something becomes very difficult, but just to kind of, help in the process of imagining. I'm reminded of, I'm of course much older than all of you. So, the point that I was making was that, it's not easy to imagine what, a different world order would be like. The paradigm shift that I think Vaseem was talking about. But one of the ways to do it is to think of the things that we can do without. Okay, the things that so I was quoting a song, back in the 1980s when I was much younger, which I'm sure that you would not know at all. It's so unfashionable now. But one of the lines went, shout, shout. These are the things we can do without. Now there's this kind of a, this element of a kind of screaming against something that has gone wrong in this song. So what are the things that we can do without? If we think about that, well, clearly one of the things that we can do without is ideas of the free market, for example, which I'm someone who believes that they haven't brought us, it hasn't improved people's lives. The idea of the free market has been around for the last 3 decades, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the East European socialist command economies. That was back in 1989, 1990, around that time. I think what free markets do is that they create these free markets in housing and in healthcare, which is very detrimental to people's lives. So what needs to be brought back is the ways in which governments can meaningfully intervene in people's lives, states intervening to make people's lives better. Now, what we see right now is states not intervening, but interfering in people's lives. When governments and states are snooping, as we've been, kind of told by these Pegasus revelations, it's a matter of great concern when, states and governments are not really interested in improving people's lives materially, but, wanting to listen to what people are talking about. That's a matter of great concern. So what we need to is, to do without states that snoop into people's lives and direct them in terms of what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing, but to kind of facilitate how people can lead meaningful lives. So I think that's one thing that, people, we can certainly do without. Another thing I'm sure that we can do without are these kind of authoritarian strongmen across the world. I mean, they've really, made a hash of the way that they have ruled their people. Most of these people, authoritarian strongmen, have made a mess of the way they have handled the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, look at the women who've done it much better. I mean, look at New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, for example. The way that she has handled it. I mean, there are plenty of women leaders in this world who you can actually think of as exemplary in the way that they've handled it. Which means that we need to move to a world order which is much more just. So we can certainly do without this. I mean, there are lots and lots of things that we can, all think of what we can do without. But I think in order to kind of imagine and envision a better, just, more fair, happier, peaceful, self-respecting world order, there are lots and lots of things that we can do without. So broadly, as I said, neoliberalism and free markets and all these strongmen across the world who want to kind of stamp their influence on people's lives, perhaps need to think again in terms of what they have done for people's betterment. Yeah, that's what I would have to say.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful talk, and we really enjoyed getting your viewpoint and reading your essay as well. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.